be honest, I don't actually think that is the case. I think that's a very small minority of people that are criticising us. The facts are out there. We were dining very close to the children and we were checking on them very, very regularly. We are very responsible parents and we love our children so much, and I think it's only a very few people that are actually criticising us.
In an early interview, Madeleine McCann's mother speaks quietly. Her words are short, direct. Someone had taken her. That belief formed before the investigation truly began. On the night of May 3, 2007, the McCann family was staying in apartment 5A at the Ocean, Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal. Madeleine and her younger twin siblings had been put to bed earlier that evening. The adults left the apartment to dine at a nearby restaurant. The distance was short. They say they returned at intervals to check on the children. At around 10 p.m., Kate McCann went into the bedroom. Madeleine was gone. Her bed was empty. The twins were still asleep. Kate noticed that the bedroom window was open. The shutter was raised. From that moment, the situation was treated as an abduction. Resort staff were alerted. Guests joined the search. Portuguese police were contacted shortly after. When officers arrived, they were given an account of the evening that sounded organized and responsible. The children had been left sleeping. Checks had been carried out. Madeleine had been seen earlier. One detail immediately became central. An adult stated that during one of the routine checks, he had entered the bedroom and saw all 3 children asleep. He said nothing appeared out of place. No disturbance was noticed. That statement did more than describe a moment. It established a timeline. If Madeleine had been seen asleep during that check, then her disappearance had to occur after it. That assumption shaped the early direction of the investigation. Police focused their attention on a narrow window of time. Search efforts were organized around it. The open window and raised shutter took on immediate significance. At this stage, there was no public doubt, no suggestion that the account might be incomplete. Early interviews are often taken at face value, especially when given under stress. But investigations do not rely on one version forever. As questioning continued, the same details were asked again, separately, repeatedly, carefully. What time was the check? Who entered the room? What exactly was seen? The answers did not contradict each other outright, but they were no longer perfectly identical. Small clarifications appeared. Timings shifted slightly. Certainty softened. Nothing dramatic. But quietly, the first story, the one everything was built on, began to move. And once that happens, investigators have to stop and reassess what they thought they knew. When police return to the statements, they are not looking for lies. They are looking for alignment. In missing child investigations, early interviews are expected to contain emotion, confusion, even gaps. What matters is whether the core structure stays the same. In this case, the structure was built around one key moment, a routine check during which Madeleine was said to be asleep. Investigators began testing that detail. What time did the check happen? Who entered the bedroom? How long did it last? Where were the other adults at that moment? The answers did not collapse, but they did not line up perfectly either. The timing of the check began to shift by minutes. The order of events became less fixed. Descriptions grew less exact. Individually, none of this was unusual. But together, it created a problem, because if Madeleine was seen asleep at a certain time, investigators would expect specific things to follow. They would expect a narrow window for her disappearance, a short period where someone could enter and leave unnoticed, a window that should, in theory, produce witnesses, movement, or sound. That is how police logic works. But as the timeline softened, the window stretched. And a stretched window changes everything. It widens the number of possible scenarios. It weakens assumptions made early. It forces investigators to reconsider what they thought was solid. At the same time, the physical scene was offering limited answers. There were no confirmed signs of forced entry beyond the open window and shutter. No verified eyewitness placing a stranger near the apartment at the critical moment. No clear forensic trail leading outward. This left police with a difficult question. Not about guilt, but about accuracy. If the timing could not be fixed with confidence, then the starting point of the investigation could not be fixed either. That does not mean the original account was false. It means it could not be relied upon without reservation. And in serious investigations, that distinction matters. Because when a case begins with an assumption, even a reasonable one, every piece of evidence that follows is interpreted through it. At this stage, police had not reached conclusions. But internally, something had changed. The investigation could no longer move forward as if the timeline were settled. It had to pause, re-evaluate, and consider possibilities that had not been part of the first story. Once the timeline could no longer be treated as fixed, the investigation had to change with it. This was not a public moment. There was no announcement, no statement saying the original version was unreliable. But inside the inquiry into Madeleine McCann, priorities began to shift. When a disappearance is believed to happen within a narrow time window, police look outward. They focus on who could have entered, who could have been seen, and who might have left unnoticed. When that window expands, the investigation widens in a different way. Investigators now had to consider that the moment Madeleine vanished might not be as clearly defined as first believed. That uncertainty affected how evidence was weighed. Witness statements that had been dismissed as irrelevant were reconsidered. Movements that did not fit the early timeline were no longer excluded. The lack of confirmed sightings became more significant, not less. The open window and raised shutter remained important, but they could no longer be treated as definitive proof of how or when Madeleine was taken. Without a reliable time anchor, those details could support more than one scenario. At the same time, the absence of certain evidence began to matter. There were no confirmed reports of a disturbance heard at the apartment during the critical period. No verified witness placing a stranger inside the apartment. No clear forensic trail leading away from the scene. None of this proved what happened. But it complicated what investigators could say with confidence. As a result, the investigation became more cautious in its internal assessments. Assumptions made early were no longer treated as firm ground. Lines of inquiry that depended on a precise timeline weakened. This is where many long-running cases slow down. Not because investigators stop working, but because certainty disappears. When police cannot confidently answer when something happened, answering how becomes far more difficult. And without those answers, identifying who becomes even harder. From this point forward, the case carried a structural problem. Every new lead had to be tested against a beginning that no longer felt stable. Every theory had to work across multiple possible timelines, not just one. The investigation had not failed, but it had lost its anchor. And once that happens, progress becomes slower, heavier, and more vulnerable to doubt. Years have passed since Madeleine McCann disappeared, but the early uncertainty has never fully faded. As the investigation continued, theories changed. Suspects emerged, then fell away. Search areas expanded, then narrowed again. What never changed was the problem investigators faced at the beginning. They could not lock down the moment Madeleine vanished. Without a fixed time, evidence becomes harder to interpret. Witness statements lose precision. Forensic absences become ambiguous instead of meaningful. This is why the earliest version of events still matters today, not because it proves what happened, but because it shaped everything that followed. Search efforts were initially focused on a narrow window of time. When that window expanded later, early opportunities could not be recovered. Movements that might have been relevant at one moment were already gone. This is not unusual in long-running cases. It is a known investigative risk. The first version of events often becomes the lens through which everything else is viewed. When that version changes, investigators are forced to reconsider decisions made before the shift. Decisions that cannot be undone. Over time, public discussion of the case moved toward theories and speculation. But internally, the unresolved issue remained simpler and more structural. The beginning was never fully secure. That does not mean anyone intended to mislead. It does not mean the truth was deliberately hidden. In high-stress situations, memory is fragile. Details are recalled out of sequence. Certainty can feel stronger than accuracy. Investigators understand this. But investigations depend on precision, not belief. And when the first belief becomes unstable, the investigation carries that instability forward. Today, every new development in the case is still measured against an opening that never fully settled. Each possibility must work across more than one timeline. Each theory must explain gaps that formed early. That is why the first lie matters. Not as an accusation, but as a turning point. It was the moment when confidence entered the case before certainty. And once that happens, even the most determined investigation must fight against doubt from the very start. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann did not become complex years later. It became complex on the first night, when the story everyone relied on began to shift.